I only wanted to sit next to my 9-year-old grandson for Thanksgiving dinner. That was my only mistake. Before I could even pull out the heavy mahogany chair, my daughter-in-law's mother slapped me so hard across the face that the entire dining room went dead silent. She screamed that poor people needed to eat outside on the patio and not soil the table of high society. My own son just stared at his plate and said nothing. But before I could turn away and leave, my grandson stood up, threw his silver fork onto his porcelain plate, and said one sentence that completely shattered their perfect little world. If you are watching this right now, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is the story of how a single moment of greed and cruelty forced me to destroy the very people I spent my entire life protecting. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Your support means the world to a man telling his truth. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 78 years old, and for most of my life, I ran a massive freight and logistics company here in the United States. I spent decades on the road and in the boardroom building an empire from a single rusty truck into a nationwide fleet that spanned the entire country. But looking at me that Thursday evening, you would never have guessed any of that. I was wearing my favorite faded flannel shirt and a pair of worn-out denim jeans. I like to keep things simple. After my beautiful wife, Martha, passed away 5 years ago, I made a solemn promise to her. I stepped down from the daily operations, handed the reins of the company over to my son Derek, and moved out of the massive main estate into a small rustic log cabin at the edge of our 50-acre property in Connecticut. I wanted Derek to feel like the man of the house. I wanted him to build his own confidence, so I made myself look like a penniless old retiree on paper living quietly in the background. That Thanksgiving, the main house was blindingly bright. Victoria, my 40-year-old daughter-in-law, had spared absolutely no expense. The dining room looked like something out of a luxury lifestyle magazine, filled with towering floral arrangements, imported crystal glasses, and the heavy, rich scent of roasted turkey and expensive wine. The room was packed with Victoria's friends, local politicians, and various socialites she wanted to impress. And sitting right at the head of the table was Patricia Sterling, Victoria's mother. Patricia was a woman who practically suffocated you with her heavy perfume and her towering arrogance. She was 65, dripping in diamonds that I suspected she could no longer afford, and she always looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had somehow wandered into her immaculate yard. I quietly walked into the dining room. I did not want any attention or grand introductions. I just wanted to spend some time with my grandson Leo. He is a bright, incredibly observant boy, the only genuine light in that massive, echoing mansion. I saw an empty chair right next to him. I smiled at Leo and he smiled back, his eyes lighting up with genuine happiness. But just as my hand touched the back of the mahogany chair to pull it out, a hand covered in heavy gold rings slammed down over mine. It was Patricia. Before I could even register what was happening, she yanked the chair violently out of my grip, and then she swung her hand and slapped me squarely across the left side of my face. The crack of her palm against my cheek echoed through the massive dining room like a gunshot. The sharp edge of one of her diamond rings caught my lip, and I instantly tasted the warm metallic tang of blood pooling in my mouth. The low hum of jazz music and the lively chatter of the wealthy guests stopped dead. Absolute suffocating silence fell over the room. I stood there, stunned, my cheek burning with a fierce, humiliating sting. Patricia stepped closer to me, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated disgust. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward the hallway and screamed at the top of her lungs. She told me that poor, filthy people needed to eat outside on the patio. She said I was a national embarrassment, a penniless old hermit who had no right to soil a table meant for high society. She demanded that I take a paper plate to the kitchen like the hired help. I slowly turned my eyes toward my son. Derek was sitting just 2 seats away. He is 45 years, the supposed chief executive officer of my freight company, a man who wears $5,000 suits and drives a luxury car I bought for him. But in that moment, he was nothing more than a coward. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice to defend his father. He simply stared down at his slice of turkey, his shoulders hunched, refusing to even meet my gaze. Victoria, sitting right next to him, actually smirked. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, clearly enjoying the public humiliation I was being subjected to. The sheer opulence of the room suddenly felt like a suffocating trap. The heavy, rich scent of the roasted turkey, which just moments ago had smelled of warmth and family tradition, now twisted into something nauseatingly artificial. I watched the golden light from the massive crystal chandelier reflect off Victoria's glass. She didn't just sip. She savored the moment her eyes locked onto mine with a cold reptilian satisfaction. Around the table, the elite guests remained frozen in a macabre tableau. A local politician suspended his silver fork halfway to his mouth. A socialite's diamond necklace caught the light as she nervously touched her throat. Nobody breathed. Nobody dared to break the spell of Patricia's towering arrogance, but it was Derek who truly broke my heart in that terrible, stretched-out second. My son, the man I had entrusted with a nationwide empire, seemed to physically shrink inside his expensive, custom-tailored suit. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped his linen napkin beneath the table, his shoulders rounding inward as if trying to fold himself out of existence. He was terrified not of the physical violence that had just occurred, but of the social friction, the potential disruption to his fragile, bought-and-paid-for aristocracy. I had spent 40 years shielding him from the harsh realities of the world, building an impenetrable fortress around him, only to realize I had successfully raised a man who possessed no spine of his own. The metallic taste of blood on my tongue was nothing compared to the bitter, choking ash of realizing my legacy was in the hands of a coward. I felt a deep, crushing sorrow expand in my chest. It was not because of the physical pain, but because of the profound, breathtaking betrayal. I had sacrificed my youth, my sweat, and my tears to build the very walls that surrounded them, and this was my reward. I took a deep breath, deciding that preserving my dignity was far more important than causing a screaming match in front of strangers. I turned my back to the table, preparing to walk out the front door and return to my cabin in the freezing rain, but I never made it to the hallway. A sudden sharp sound shattered the silence. It was the loud clatter of heavy silver hitting porcelain. My grandson Leo had stood up. He threw his fork directly onto his plate, staring absolute daggers at Patricia. For a 9-year-old boy, his voice was remarkably steady, carrying a heavy weight that made every adult in the room freeze in their tracks. He looked right into Patricia's eyes and asked her a question that felt like an explosive detonating in the middle of the room. He said, if Grandpa is so poor that he has to eat outside, then why was Dad crying in the garage last night, begging Grandpa's voicemail to pay off your $100,000 credit card debt, Grandma? The silence that followed was terrifying. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug, all the color instantly drained from Patricia's face, leaving her looking like a pale, panicked ghost. Victoria gasped, her hand trembling so violently that the delicate stem of her crystal wine glass snapped, shattering against the table and spilling expensive champagne everywhere. Derek finally looked up, his face pale with sheer terror, his eyes darting frantically between me and his son. The wealthy guests exchanged awkward, uncomfortable glances, suddenly realizing that the aristocratic facade of the Sterling and Cole family was nothing but a fragile, crumbling lie. I stood there for a long moment, letting the sheer weight of Leo's words settle over the room. I wiped the small drop of blood from my lower lip with the back of my thumb. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an apology or an explanation. I just looked at Derek one last time, turned on my heel, and walked out of the mansion. The crisp, freezing air of a Connecticut November hit my face the moment I stepped outside. A cold, steady rain had begun to fall, washing away the artificial warmth of the evening. I pulled my thin flannel jacket tighter around my shoulders and began the long walk across the sprawling 50-acre property back to my log cabin. Every step on the wet gravel felt impossibly heavy, not with age, but with the crushing realization of what my family had truly become. As I walked through the darkness, guided only by the distant security lights of the estate, my mind drifted back to Martha, my beautiful, wise Martha. When she was diagnosed with a terminal illness 5 years ago, she held my hand in her hospital bed and made me promise to take a step back. She knew I was a workaholic, a man married to his freight routes and corporate spreadsheets. She told me to let Derek take the wheel, to let him make his own mistakes and build his own character. She believed that giving him the ultimate responsibility of the company would turn him into a strong, independent man. We agreed to let him live in the main house to raise his family, with all the space and comfort in the world, while I would take the small, quiet cabin by the woods. I kept that promise faithfully. I legally handed Derek the title of Chief Executive Officer. I let him make the decisions, sign the operational contracts, and play the role of a titan of industry. I made sure my own bank accounts looked modest to the naked eye, keeping my true wealth securely hidden in an ironclad trust. I wanted to see if they would respect me as a father rather than worship me as a bank. Tonight I finally got my devastating answer. I reached the wooden porch of my cabin, my boots soaked from the freezing puddles. I stood under the small awning, the cold rain dripping from the wooden beams, and waited. A part of me, the hopeful, foolish part of a father's heart, expected to see the headlights of Derek's car coming up the gravel path. I waited for him to run out into the rain, to apologize, to tell me that Patricia had crossed a terrible line and that he was deeply sorry for freezing up. I waited for 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing came. The driveway remained completely dark and silent. I unlocked the heavy wooden door of my cabin and stepped inside. The air was cold, smelling faintly of pine and old books. I didn't bother turning on the main overhead light, just flipping the switch on a small desk lamp that cast a warm, dim glow across the room. I walked over to the small kitchen counter to grab a paper towel for my bleeding lip. But as I passed my heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room, my boots crunched against something on the hardwood floor. I frowned and looked down. There were tiny shavings of gray metal scattered on the rug. My heart skipped a beat. I immediately knelt down and inspected the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. It was the drawer where I kept a very specific, highly confidential steel lockbox. I pulled the drawer open. The lockbox was still there, but my blood ran completely cold when I saw it. The heavy steel latch was covered in deep, jagged gouge marks. Someone had taken a heavy flathead screwdriver or a crowbar to it, frantically trying to pry it open. The metal was bent and warped, the gray paint chipped away to reveal the shiny steel underneath. Whoever did this was desperate, rushed, and incredibly careless. I traced my fingers over the scratches, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. They didn't know exactly what was inside this box, but they knew it was important. Inside that damaged steel container rested the master deed to the entire 50-acre estate, along with the corporate charter of the freight company. Both of those massive assets were held in an irrevocable trust under my name. Derek was the acting executive, yes, but he did not own the land or the company itself. I did. I was the absolute beneficiary and the sole trustee. Someone had been inside my private home while I was at dinner. Someone was trying to steal the physical documents of my ownership. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. Leo's outburst at the dinner table echoed in my mind. $100,000 in credit card debt. A desperate phone call in the garage. And now a forced entry into my private cabin to steal my legal documents. This was no longer just about a disrespectful mother-in-law or a cowardly son who couldn't stand up for his father. This was about survival. This was a calculated attack on my life and my legacy. I remained kneeling on the cold hardwood floor, the chill seeping through the worn denim of my jeans. I slowly ran my calloused thumb over the jagged gouge marks again. They were deep, frantic, and violently erratic. I closed my eyes and could almost hear the desperate, heavy breathing of whoever had squatted in this exact spot wildly jamming a piece of heavy iron into the lockbox. The sheer intimacy of the violation made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This cabin was my sanctuary, the only place on the 50-acre property where I still felt Martha's gentle presence. To know that someone from the main house had crept through the darkness, bypassing my rusted truck, slipping through my door while I was being publicly degraded, felt like a knife twisting slowly in my gut. The darkness of the room began to press in on me, but it wasn't a frightening darkness. It was a familiar old friend. It was the same pitch-black darkness I used to stare into during the early days of the freight company, sleeping in the cab of my single rusty truck on the side of a frozen highway, calculating exactly how to outmaneuver massive corporate rivals. They thought retirement had made me soft. They thought the faded flannel and the quiet demeanor meant the fire had completely burned out. But staring at that ruined steel, the grieving widower vanished. The ruthless, hyper-vigilant CEO who had crushed competitors and dominated boardrooms for 4 decades woke up, his mind snapping into a grid of cold, calculated logistics. I stood up slowly, the dull ache in my cheek completely forgotten. I walked over to the window and stared out through the rain toward the glowing windows of the massive mansion in the distance. They thought I was just a clueless, penniless old man. They thought I was weak, easily pushed aside, manipulated, and humiliated. But they had forgotten who built the very roof over their heads. They had forgotten the ruthless, calculating businessman who spent 40 years destroying competitors and building a national empire from the dirt up. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, my hand perfectly steady. It was time to stop playing the quiet, retired father. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, I would treat them like a hostile corporate takeover. The game had just changed, and I was going to make sure they lost absolutely everything. I stared at the gouged steel lockbox. The cold reality washed over me, erasing any lingering sting from the slap I endured earlier. My own family was plotting to steal the very foundation of my legacy. I carefully pushed the drawer shut, making sure it looked exactly as I had found it, so they would believe they simply failed to open it. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the leather armchair, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat there in the dark, piecing together the timeline of their desperation, racking up massive debts. Now the federal government was coming to collect the missing funds. I knew they would come. Cowards always return to the scene of their crimes to ensure their tracks are covered. They need to know if the victim suspects anything. They need to maintain the illusion of control. At exactly 2 a.m, the harsh glare of halogen headlights sliced through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the wooden walls of my cabin. I heard the crunch of heavy tires rolling over the wet gravel driveway. A sleek, black luxury sports utility vehicle came to a sudden halt just a few yards from my front porch. Through the rain-streaked glass of my window, I watched the driver door open. Derek stepped out into the freezing downpour, pulling his expensive cashmere coat tight around his shoulders. A moment later, Victoria emerged from the passenger side, holding a large umbrella to protect her meticulously styled hair. She was carrying something wrapped in silver foil. I remained in my chair, listening to the heavy thud of their footsteps climbing the wooden stairs of my porch. A rapid, frantic knock echoed through the quiet space. I took a deep breath, forcing my tense muscles to relax. I stood up slowly, deliberately adopting the posture of a weary, defeated old man. I shuffled toward the entrance, unlatched the heavy deadbolt, and pulled the wooden door open. Derek and Victoria stood on my porch, shivering from the damp chill of the night. Victoria immediately pushed her way inside without waiting for an invitation. She placed a glass container of leftover pecan pie on my small kitchen counter. Her face was a mask of exaggerated concern, her eyes wide and shimmering with manufactured tears. She immediately launched into a frantic, rehearsed monologue. She claimed that she was absolutely devastated by what had happened at the dinner table. She begged me to understand that her mother, Patricia, was suffering from a severe episode of medication-induced psychosis. According to Victoria, Patricia had accidentally mixed a new prescription of heavy sedatives with far too many glasses of vintage wine. She insisted that her mother had completely lost touch with reality and had no control over the vicious, cruel words she had screamed at me. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, constructed solely to protect their social standing and keep me docile. Derek stood awkwardly near the doorway, refusing to step fully onto the worn rug. He nervously rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting around the modest cabin. He let out a hollow, trembling laugh, dismissing the explosive revelation my grandson had made. He told me that Leo was just an overly imaginative child who watched too many dramatic television shows. He promised me that there was absolutely no financial trouble, insisting that the entire outburst was just a meaningless fabrication born from a child's confusion. I listened to my son lie directly to my face, feeling a profound wave of disgust. He was a man drowning in a sea of debt, yet he chose to protect his own ego rather than ask his father for help. Victoria wiped a fake tear from her cheek, but her true nature could not be hidden for long. She glanced out the window toward the gravel driveway, her upper lip curling into a sneer of pure disdain as she looked at my rusted 20-year-old Chevy truck parked outside. She muttered that it was a shame I chose to live in such squalor surrounded by old junk when I could be comfortable in a proper retirement facility. The implication was clear. She viewed my simple lifestyle not as a choice, but as an embarrassing stain on her pristine image. I ignored the insult. I played my part to perfection. I let my shoulders droop, offering them a gentle, forgiving nod. I told them that I understood how difficult growing older could be, and that I held absolutely no grudges against Patricia for her momentary lapse in judgment. I assured them that I was just a tired old man who needed his rest. The visible relief that washed over Victoria's sharp features was sickening. She truly believed she had won, having secured their false peace. Derek quickly turned around to leave, desperate to escape the suffocating tension of my cabin. He reached for the brass doorknob, but just as his fingers brushed the metal, a loud jarring ringtone erupted from the inner pocket of his coat. The sudden noise made him jump. Panic flashed across his face as he scrambled to pull the mobile phone out, his hands visibly shaking. He fumbled with the device, desperately trying to press the silent button. But in his frantic haste, the phone slipped from his grip. I lunged forward with reflexes honed by decades of hard labor, catching the device before it hit the floorboards. For one agonizing second, the bright screen was perfectly visible to me. The caller identification did not display a name or a friend. It displayed a formal automated text that read, "State Commercial Foreclosure Department." I handed the smooth, cold phone back to my son, my expression remaining perfectly blank, completely devoid of the shock that was currently racing through my veins. Derek violently snatched the small device from my outstretched hands, his face rapidly draining of all its natural color until he looked sick. He swallowed hard, letting out a nervous, breathless chuckle. He looked me in the eyes and lied straight to my face without missing a single beat, claiming that the urgent call was a late-night logistics dispatcher dealing with a highly delayed freight shipment coming from the western coast. I slowly nodded my head and offered him a quiet, reassuring smile, gently patting his damp shoulder and telling him to drive safely in the dangerous, freezing rain. I stood perfectly still in the doorway and watched the glowing red taillights of their expensive luxury vehicle slowly disappear down the dark, winding gravel driveway. As soon as they were completely out of sight, the gentle mask of the forgiving, ignorant father instantly slipped from my wrinkled face, quickly replaced by a deeply cold, highly calculating, and ruthless resolve. My magnificent corporate empire was actively bleeding out, and the entire federal government was already mercilessly circling the burning wreckage like a flock of starving vultures, waiting for their absolute final feast. For 2 agonizing days following that midnight visit, a heavy, suffocating silence hung over the property. I remained in my log cabin watching the main house through the bare branches of the November trees. The brief glimpse of that foreclosure warning on my son's phone had confirmed my darkest fears. Derek was drowning in a financial abyss of his own making, and the state was already moving to collect. I spent those 48 hours meticulously reviewing my hidden financial portfolios, ensuring that my offshore accounts and the master trust documents were completely insulated from whatever catastrophic mistakes my son had made. I drank black coffee and waited for their next move, knowing that desperate people inevitably make careless, arrogant mistakes. That mistake arrived on the crisp, freezing morning of the third day. I was sitting on my front porch, bundled in a thick wool coat, when the deep rumbling growl of a heavy diesel engine shattered the quiet tranquility of the estate. A massive commercial moving truck slowly turned off the main road, its heavy tires crunching aggressively up the long gravel driveway. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden railing and stood up, narrowing my eyes against the harsh morning glare. The truck hissed to a halt directly in front of the grand pillared entrance of the main house. A team of men wearing matching blue uniforms immediately hopped out of the cab, lowering the heavy metal ramp at the back of the vehicle. I watched in absolute disbelief as they began unloading an endless stream of pristine designer luggage. Dozens of matching leather suitcases, heavy garment bags, and ornate antique furniture were rolled down the ramp and carried toward the front doors. This was not a simple weekend visit. This was a permanent relocation. I walked down the wooden steps of my cabin, my boots crunching a steady, determined rhythm on the gravel as I crossed the sprawling lawn. The freezing wind bit at my face, but I barely felt it. My anger was a cold, focused energy. When I reached the massive stone steps of the main entrance, Victoria was already standing there holding a silver clipboard and barking sharp, condescending orders at the moving crew. She was wearing a thick cashmere sweater and holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee, looking completely in her element as the proud lady of the manor. As soon as she saw me approaching, her authoritative posture instantly shifted into a defensive, hostile stance. She practically threw her clipboard onto a nearby patio chair and marched down the steps to physically block my path. I stopped a few feet away, looking at the mountain of expensive luggage currently being hauled into the foyer. I asked her in a calm, measured voice exactly what was going on and whose belongings were moving into my house. Victoria lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a brazen, unapologetic defiance. She did not even attempt to soften her tone. She flatly stated that her mother, Patricia, was moving into the east wing of the estate on a permanent basis. According to Victoria, Patricia's mental and physical health had taken a drastic downward turn since the Thanksgiving dinner, and she now required full-time care and constant supervision. Victoria aggressively insisted that it was her duty as a daughter to provide a safe haven for her ailing mother, completely ignoring the fact that she was moving a hostile, abusive woman into a property she did not even own. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight. I reminded Victoria, keeping my voice dangerously low, that Patricia had slapped me across the face in front of a room full of guests less than a week ago. I told her that moving a woman who physically assaulted me onto my property without my explicit permission was absolutely unacceptable. Victoria scoffed, waving her hand in the air as if my strict boundaries were nothing more than a minor annoyance. She told me to stop being so dramatic, claiming that I had plenty of space in my little cabin and that Patricia's presence in the main house would not affect my simple, isolated lifestyle in the slightest. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy double doors of the grand foyer swung completely open. Patricia stepped out onto the wide stone porch. She was wearing a luxurious silk morning robe, holding a delicate teacup in her manicured hand. She did not look like a woman suffering from a severe mental decline or an unexpected health crisis. She looked radiant, arrogant, and entirely too comfortable in my home. She took a slow sip of her tea, peering down at me with that familiar, sickening expression of utter superiority. But my attention was not on her smug, wrinkled face. My eyes dropped to her neck. Resting against the expensive silk of her robe was a heavy, gleaming string of vintage pearls. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs with a sudden, violent force. They were Martha's pearls. It was the exact necklace I had custom ordered and presented to my beautiful wife on the evening of our 30th wedding anniversary. I had kept those pearls safely locked inside a velvet box in the master bedroom's private vanity, a room I had allowed Derek and Victoria to inherit when I moved out to the cabin. The sheer disrespect of the act was staggering. Patricia had not only invaded my home, she had rummaged through my deceased wife's most intimate, precious belongings and draped them around her own neck as if they were cheap costume jewelry. A hot, blinding wave of pure fury surged through my veins. I took a heavy step forward, my voice rising, in volume echoing sharply across the cold morning air. I pointed a trembling finger directly at Patricia's chest and demanded that she take the necklace off her throat that very second. I told her she had absolutely no right to touch my late wife's possessions, let alone wear them out in the open like a morbid trophy. The reaction from Victoria was instantaneous and terrifyingly calculated. She did not apologize. She did not ask her mother to remove the stolen jewelry. Instead, Victoria let out a loud theatrical gasp, bringing her hands up to her face in mock horror. She deliberately raised her voice, ensuring that every single member of the moving crew could clearly hear her. She backed away from me, acting as though she were in genuine physical danger. She screamed that I was becoming senile and deeply aggressive. She cried out that my mind was completely slipping, claiming that I was hallucinating and starting violent altercations over meaningless delusions. She looked frantically at the men carrying the furniture, yelling that my dementia was making me a danger to myself and my family. Patricia immediately joined the performance. She clutched the stolen pearls to her chest, putting on a flawless display of the terrified, fragile victim. She whimpered loudly, asking Victoria why the crazy old man was screaming at her over a cheap necklace she had bought at a department store years ago. I froze, the cold wind whipping against my back. I looked at the moving crew. 3 large men had stopped their work entirely, staring at me with expressions of deep concern and pity. They did not see a heartbroken widower defending his wife's memory. They saw exactly what Victoria and Patricia wanted them to see. They saw an unhinged, confused, and dangerously aggressive elderly man harassing 2 defenseless women on a crisp Sunday morning. The trap was brilliant in its cruelty. If I continued to yell, if I marched up those steps and physically tore the pearls from Patricia's neck, I would only be providing them with undeniable, perfectly orchestrated proof of my supposed mental instability. They were laying the psychological groundwork to strip me of my legal autonomy. They were building a public narrative of my rapid cognitive decline, reliable witness by reliable witness. I forced my jaw to relax. I swallowed the bitter, burning taste of sheer rage and profound humiliation. I lowered my trembling hand, deliberately breaking eye contact with the venomous women standing on the porch. I mumbled a quiet, disjointed apology, slurring my words just enough to sound thoroughly confused, disoriented, and utterly defeated. I turned my back on them and began the slow, humiliating walk back to my solitary cabin. Behind me, I could hear Victoria loudly thanking the movers for their patience, expertly securing their sympathy and cementing the tragic manufactured lie of my progressing dementia. But as I walked across the wet, freezing grass, my initial spike of adrenaline slowly faded, leaving behind a sharp, hyper-vigilant, and ruthless mental clarity. I purposely kept my head down, but my eyes aggressively scanned the perimeter of the sprawling estate. Near the tall, meticulously manicured hedges that perfectly separated the main residential garden from the western guest driveway, I spotted something completely out of place. 2 strange men, wearing sharp, professional gray suits, were standing near the absolute edge of the property line. They were completely ignoring the loud, chaotic commotion of the moving trucks. One of the men was intensely focused on a thick, leather-bound clipboard, rapidly taking detailed notes. The other man was holding a highly sophisticated laser measuring device, pointing the bright red beam toward the structural corners of the main house and the surrounding guest quarters. They were not local gardeners. They were not contracted maintenance workers. They were moving with the precise, clinical, and undeniable efficiency of corporate property appraisers. The final piece of the devastating puzzle clicked perfectly into place inside my mind. Derek and Victoria were not just moving Patricia into the estate to save on her residential rent. They were not just building a fake medical history to officially declare me mentally incompetent and seize my physical autonomy. They were desperately preparing to sell the entire 50-acre property right out from under my feet. They absolutely needed the exact market valuation of the estate to cover the catastrophic crippling debts they had secretly accumulated in my name over the past 3 years. The federal government was rapidly coming to collect their stolen money, and my cowardly son was actively planning to illegally auction off the very ground I walked on just to save his own pathetic skin from absolute financial ruin. I stood perfectly still near the tree line watching the two appraisers pack their laser equipment into the trunk of their sleek silver sedan. The freezing wind whipped through the bare branches, mirroring the cold emptiness inside my chest. My own flesh and blood had crossed a line I never thought possible. They were methodically mapping out the financial value of my sanctuary, treating the estate I built with decades of sweat as a desperate bargaining chip to save themselves from absolute ruin. I turned my back on the main house and retreated to the quiet safety of my log cabin. As the evening wore on, a harsh, freezing rain began to batter the thick glass of my cabin windows. I sat in my worn leather armchair in the dark. It matched the heavy dread slowly wrapping itself around my heart. Even through the relentless drumming of the storm outside, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of violent screaming echoing from the direction of the main estate. Derek and Victoria were tearing each other apart. The pressure of their hidden financial collapse was finally fracturing their polished facade. I closed my eyes, wondering just how deep the rot had spread. Just before 9 o'clock, a soft, hesitant thud tapped against the heavy wood of my back door. It was so faint that I initially mistook it for a stray branch blown by the wind. But then it came again, slightly more urgent, a rapid rhythm that signaled pure desperation. I pushed myself out of the armchair, my joints aching from the damp cold, and walked to the entryway. I unlatched the heavy iron deadbolt and pulled the door open, letting the freezing rain sweep into the warm cabin. Standing on the small wooden porch was my 9-year-old grandson, Leo. He was completely soaked to the bone. His thin winter jacket was plastered to his small frame, and his dark hair was matted flat against his forehead. He was trembling violently, his teeth chattering so hard I could hear the clicking sound over the roaring wind. Without saying a single word, I reached out, grabbed his small shoulders, and pulled him out of the freezing storm. I quickly shut and locked the door behind us, blocking out the harsh elements of the night. I hurried to the bathroom and grabbed a thick, dry towel, wrapping it tightly around his shaking shoulders. I guided him to the small sofa near the electric radiator, turning the heat up to its maximum setting. I asked him what he was doing running across the massive property in the middle of a freezing thunderstorm. Leo looked up at me, his large eyes swimming with unshed tears. He looked incredibly small, trapped in a toxic war zone created by the people supposed to protect him. He swallowed hard, pulling the thick towel tighter around his neck. He whispered that his parents were fighting again, screaming so loudly that it made the walls of his bedroom shake. He explained that he had sneaked downstairs to hide in the small alcove next to his father's private home office, because he was terrified they were going to hurt each other. He told me that his father was crying, throwing heavy books off the shelves and sweeping everything off the desk in a fit of absolute panic. Then Leo slowly reached a small, trembling hand into the damp pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a crumpled, severely wrinkled piece of paper. The edges of the document were charred and blackened, crumbling slightly as he held it out to me. He whispered that his father had crumpled it up and thrown it directly into the fireplace grate, screaming that their lives were completely over. But the fire had not been lit yet. As soon as his parents had stormed out of the office to continue their vicious argument in the upstairs hallway, Leo had crawled out of his hiding spot, reached into the dirty ashes, and rescued the discarded paper. He knew he had to bring it straight to me. I took the damaged document from his small hands, my fingers smoothing out the deep, harsh creases. I stepped closer to the desk lamp, letting the warm yellow light illuminate the heavy black text printed across the top of the page. The official, undeniable seal of the Internal Revenue Service, sat squarely in the upper left corner. Below it, printed in bold, unforgiving letters, were the words, "Final notice of seizure and intent to levy." My eyes frantically scanned the dense legal paragraphs, searching for the core of the devastation. I found the final balance owed at the bottom of the first page. The breath completely left my lungs. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a physical blow. The freight company, the massive corporate empire I had spent 40 years building with blood and sleepless nights, owed the federal government a staggering $8 million in unpaid corporate taxes, severe penalties, and compounding interest. I read the terrifying figure again, praying that my aging eyes were simply deceiving me. But the numbers remained exactly the same. $8 million. Derek had not just mismanaged a few quarterly budgets or lost a couple of shipping contracts. He had systematically drained the corporate accounts over the course of 3 years, completely ignoring the most basic fundamental tax obligations required to keep the business operational. He had effectively driven my life's work directly into the ground to fund his wife's absurd, lavish lifestyle and mask their mounting personal debts. But the absolute worst part of the document was the section detailing the collateral. The federal government had already placed a massive lien on the company assets, and because the company was inherently tied to my name through the overarching trust structure, the 50-acre estate was officially listed as a targeted asset for total seizure. The state was preparing to physically confiscate the land, the mansion, and my cabin to satisfy the massive debt. I slowly lowered the paper, the horrifying reality settling over me like a suffocating blanket of lead. They were not appraising the property to sell it for a profit. They were desperately trying to figure out if liquidating my sanctuary would be enough to keep themselves out of a federal prison cell. I looked down at my grandson. He was watching my face with an expression of pure, unadulterated fear. He reached out and gently tugged on the sleeve of my faded flannel shirt. He leaned forward and whispered a single sentence that completely stopped the blood flowing through my veins. He said Grandpa Mom told Dad they have to get rid of the old man's signature immediately. What does that mean? I stood frozen, the charred paper slipping from my grasp. The final, terrifying piece of the puzzle locked into place. Getting rid of my signature did not mean asking me to sign a document. It meant entirely removing my legal capacity to object. It meant eliminating my autonomy. They were completely cornered, facing federal ruin, and they had just decided that my freedom was the required price for their ultimate survival. I gently folded the ruined piece of paper and slipped it deep into the breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt. I looked down at my young grandson. His small frame was still shivering uncontrollably underneath the thick cotton bath towel I had wrapped around his shoulders. I knelt down to his eye level, placed my weathered hands on his trembling arms, and offered him the absolute most reassuring smile I could possibly muster. I told Leo that he was an incredibly brave boy for rescuing this document and bringing it straight to me. I promised him with absolute certainty that everything was going to be entirely fine, and that I would personally handle this terrible situation. I instructed him to sneak very quietly back up the main stairs to his bedroom, to crawl deep under his warm blankets, and to pretend that he had been soundly sleeping the entire time. I made him swear a solemn promise not to tell his mother or his cowardly father that he had secretly visited my cabin tonight. Leo nodded his head solemnly, trusting my word without a single trace of doubt in his innocent eyes. I opened the heavy wooden door shielding him from the driving rain as he sprinted across the dark, flooded lawn toward the side entrance of the massive main house. Once he was safely inside the mansion, I closed my door and turned back to the quiet, suffocating emptiness of my room. A cold, highly calculating fury settled deep into my aging bones. The time for playing the docile, ignorant retiree was completely over. I grabbed my heavy, waterproof winter coat from the iron hook by the door and stepped out into the freezing, violent storm. The aggressive wind howled fiercely through the towering oak trees, whipping the icy rain sharply against my wrinkled face. I did not feel the bitter, biting cold, I only felt the burning, relentless determination to look my treacherous son directly in the eyes. I marched aggressively across the sprawling estate, the wet gravel crunching loudly and rhythmically beneath the thick rubber soles of my heavy work boots. My destination was the massive four-car garage attached securely to the eastern wing of the sprawling mansion. I knew Derek often retreated there when he was feeling overwhelmed, surrounding himself with the ridiculously expensive luxury vehicles he had selfishly bought with my stolen money. My right hand tightly gripped the damp fabric of my coat pocket, feeling the crinkled edges of the Internal Revenue Service notice safely hidden inside. I was fully prepared to kick the heavy side door wide open, to throw the terrifying federal document directly onto his pristine concrete floor, and to demand an absolute unfiltered confession. I desperately wanted to see the exact moment his arrogant, aristocratic facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. As I rapidly approached the side entrance of the brightly lit garage, a sudden, pathetic noise made me stop dead in my tracks. Even through the relentless pounding of the severe thunderstorm, I could clearly hear the muffled, broken sound of a grown man sobbing uncontrollably. I pressed my back flat against the cold, wet brick wall of the estate, slowly inching my way closer to the slightly ajar side door. A narrow sliver of bright artificial fluorescent light spilled out onto the flooded, paved driveway. I held my breath, closing my eyes, and listened closely to the chaotic scene unfolding inside. Victoria was pacing rapidly back and forth across the polished garage floor, the sharp, aggressive clicking of her designer high heels echoing loudly against the vast walls. She was screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, her shrill voice dripping with sheer venom, utter contempt, and absolute panic. She furiously demanded to know why Derek was sitting pathetically on the floor, crying like a helpless child, when they were on the very verge of losing absolutely everything they owned. Derek let out a loud, pathetic gasp, audibly struggling to catch his breath between his heavy, heaving sobs. His voice cracked terribly as he yelled back at her, his tone incredibly heavy with pure, unadulterated terror. He screamed loudly that they were completely trapped with no way out. He frantically cried out that the federal government was already actively preparing to seize the entire property, and that they had absolutely no conceivable way to pay the massive $8 million tax debt they had foolishly hidden from me. Victoria abruptly stopped her frantic pacing. Her voice suddenly dropped to a dangerous, lethal whisper that sent a violent, icy chill directly down my spine. She aggressively told him to stop his pathetic whining immediately and to just simply forge my signature on the master trust documents. She arrogantly insisted that they could easily transfer the estate to a private buyer and quickly wire the enormous pile of cash to an untraceable offshore account before the federal agents ever actually knocked on their massive front door. Derek let out another desperate, heaving sob, hitting his fist against the concrete floor. He cried out loudly that she was completely insane for even suggesting such a dangerous plan. He screamed in sheer panic that you cannot just forge a signature on a highly secure, irrevocable trust. He wildly told her that the central bank would instantly flag the suspicious transaction, that the intense legal scrutiny would be absolute, and that he would spend the entire rest of his miserable life rotting away in a dark federal prison cell. He was completely terrified of getting caught and facing the severe consequences of his own disastrous financial actions. Victoria did not miss a single beat, completely unaffected by his profound desperation. She snapped back at him with a profound cruelty that entirely defied normal human comprehension. She coldly told him that if he was far too scared to simply forge the signature, they would just easily make me entirely unfit to legally hold the trust. She calmly and ruthlessly stated that they would get me officially declared mentally incompetent by a medical professional. She smugly revealed that she had already called Preston, confirming aloud that the corrupt doctor was perfectly willing to supply a highly detailed, entirely fake medical diagnosis to lock me away permanently in a state-run facility. I stood completely frozen in the dark shadows of the wet driveway, letting the freezing, relentless rain soak entirely through the heavy fabric of my winter coat. My cold heart turned to solid stone within my chest. My own flesh and blood son was not shedding endless tears because he bravely wanted to defend my hard-earned fortune or fiercely protect my lifelong legacy. He was only crying pathetically because he was far too scared to physically commit the actual criminal forgery himself. He possessed absolutely no moral objections to stealing my property, only a deep, cowardly fear of the potential legal repercussions. Meanwhile, his ruthlessly ambitious wife was actively and excitedly plotting to erase my legal existence entirely without any hesitation whatsoever. They were both fully prepared to sacrifice my fundamental freedom, completely willing to permanently lock me away inside a highly secure psychiatric ward just to desperately save themselves. The morning sun broke through the rain clouds, casting long shadows across the damp hardwood floor of my solitary cabin. I stood in front of the scratched bathroom mirror and splashed freezing water over my tired face. The burning anger from the previous night had completely solidified into a freezing, calculated resolve. I knew exactly what I needed to do. If I marched into the main house and confronted them with the stolen tax document, they would immediately deny everything. They would panic, hire ruthless defense attorneys, and accelerate their malicious plans to physically remove me from the property. I could not fight their deeply rooted treachery with righteous anger. I had to fight their deception with an even greater deception of my own. If Victoria and my cowardly son Derek wanted to build a false public narrative that I was rapidly losing my mind, I was going to gladly hand them the very bricks and mortar they needed to construct that massive lie. I messed up my thinning gray hair, vigorously rubbing my hands through it until it stood up in wild patches. I unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my faded flannel shirt, pulling the collar down so the fabric hung carelessly across my hunched shoulders. I took a deep breath, fully slipping into the theatrical role of my entire life, and shuffled slowly out the wooden door. The custom mahogany front doors of the sprawling estate were unlocked. I pushed them open with a trembling hand and stepped into the brightly lit foyer. The enormous house smelled intensely of expensive floral perfume and freshly brewed espresso. I immediately hunched my shoulders forward, letting my hands tremble visibly at my sides. I began to wander aimlessly between the wide marble foyer and the sunken formal living room, muttering frantically under my breath. I opened decorative wooden cigar boxes, lifted heavy silk throw pillows off the couches, and aimlessly patted the polished surfaces of the antique end tables. My breathing was deliberately shallow, rapid, and erratic. I made sure my heavy work boots dragged loudly across the pristine Persian rugs to draw attention to myself. Patricia walked out of the gourmet kitchen holding a steaming ceramic mug. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me frantically turning over a heavy silver serving tray on the coffee table. She let out a loud theatrical sigh of absolute disgust. She aggressively demanded to know what on earth I was doing, making such a chaotic mess in her pristine living space. I slowly turned my head to look at her, making sure my eyes were wide, panicked, and remarkably unfocused. I stammered pathetically, deliberately, letting my voice crack with manufactured terror. I told her that I was desperately looking for Martha's diamond wedding ring. I rambled incoherently about how Martha had just taken the ring off to wash the evening dinner dishes, and now the jewelry was completely gone. I begged Patricia, using a weak voice, to please help me find the ring before Martha returned and got upset. Patricia let out a harsh, echoing laugh that bounced terribly against the high vaulted ceilings. She turned her head toward the sweeping staircase and yelled loudly for Victoria. She cruelly proclaimed that the demented old bat had finally lost his remaining marbles and was currently tearing up the expensive living room, looking for a woman who had been dead for 5 long years. Victoria hurried quickly down the marble staircase. She was wearing perfectly tailored exercise clothes, looking incredibly sharp and focused. As soon as she reached the bottom step and saw me trembling helplessly near the velvet sofa, the initial irritation on her face instantly vanished. It was rapidly replaced by a look of sheer, predatory joy. Her dark eyes gleamed with a terrifying, malicious excitement. She realized instantly that the universe was freely handing her exactly what she desperately needed to execute her sinister plan. Victoria slowly approached me deliberately, adopting a sickeningly sweet, condescending tone usually reserved for pacifying frightened children. She reached carefully into the pocket of her designer athletic pants and seamlessly pulled out her modern smartphone. I immediately noticed the tiny red recording dot instantly appear on her bright screen. She held the phone casually at her waist level, making absolutely sure the sensitive microphone was pointed directly at my trembling face. She placed a gentle, patronizing hand on my hunched shoulder and softly asked me to look directly at her. She asked me in a very clear and loudly enunciated voice if I knew exactly what year it was today. She slowly asked me if I remembered that my beautiful wife, Martha, had passed away a very long time ago. She leaned in closer, narrowing her predatory eyes, and asked if I had foolishly forgotten to take my daily prescription medication again. I played right into her venomous, calculating hands. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut and shook my head erratically from side to side. I mumbled quietly that the dark days were just blending together and that I simply could not remember where I had put my orange pill bottles. I deliberately slurred my words, weakly, claiming that the inside of the house looked entirely different and that I just wanted to go back to my safe bedroom. I desperately begged her to please tell Martha that I was so sorry for losing her precious jewelry. Victoria nodded sympathetically, her thumb subtly adjusting the angle of the phone to perfectly capture every single pathetic word of my supposed mental breakdown. She softly told me that everything was going to be fine, and that they would quickly get me the professional medical help I desperately needed. She was absolutely thrilled, convinced she was successfully documenting the final collapse of my cognitive faculties. I let out a long, exhausted sigh and slowly pulled away from her firm, patronizing grip. I quietly told her that I just needed to go lay down in my dark cabin for a little while. I turned around awkwardly and began to shuffle heavily toward the massive front doors. As I passed the enormous custom-built velvet sofa situated in the very center of the living room, I deliberately dragged the toe of my heavy boot against the thick fabric of the rug. I allowed my weak knees to buckle just slightly, stumbling forward clumsily as if I had momentarily lost my physical balance. I reached my right hand out to urgently steady myself against the low armrest of the plush sofa. In that brief, chaotic fraction of a second, I smoothly slipped my mobile phone out of my deep, damp jacket pocket. With a remarkably swift flick of my right wrist, I tossed the sleek device deep underneath the heavy furniture, pushing it far out of sight into the dark shadows beneath the velvet fabric. The screen was completely dark, but the hidden voice memo application was fully running, carrying enough battery power and storage capacity to continuously record every single sound in that sprawling room for the next 10 consecutive hours. I regained my footing, offered them one last confused, empty stare, and walked out of the front door. The trap was perfectly set. The morning air was thick with a biting frost when I made my way back to the main estate. I needed a plausible excuse to return to that sprawling living room, so I carried an old, empty eyeglass case in my trembling hand. I pushed the heavy front doors open and shuffled inside, calling out weakly that I had misplaced my reading glasses. The house was blissfully quiet. Victoria and Patricia were likely still asleep in their luxurious suites, and Derek had already left for the corporate office. I did not waste a single second. I dropped to my knees beside the custom velvet sofa, reached deep into the dark shadows underneath, and retrieved my mobile phone. The battery indicator was flashing red, but the recording application had successfully captured everything. I slipped the device safely into my coat pocket and hurried back to the absolute privacy of my log cabin. I locked my door, plugged the phone into a charger, and sat down at my small kitchen table. I pressed play and listened intently to the clear digital audio. For the first few hours, there was nothing but the mundane sounds of television shows and clinking wine glasses. But then Victoria's sharp voice cut through the background noise. I heard her dialing a number on speakerphone. She greeted a man named Preston with an unsettling, overly familiar tone. She explicitly told him that the situation with the federal tax debt was becoming completely unmanageable and that Derek was on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. She instructed Preston to come to the estate that very afternoon to conduct a formal psychiatric evaluation. She coldly demanded that he write a definitive medical report stating I was suffering from advanced dementia and was entirely incapable of managing my own legal or financial affairs. The man on the other end of the line let out a low, arrogant laugh and promised he would take care of the stubborn old man. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. They were actually moving forward with their sinister plan. They had found a willing, corrupt accomplice to strip away my human rights. I spent the next few hours mentally preparing for the confrontation, carefully designing the fragile, helpless persona I needed to project. Right at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a sleek black luxury sedan crunched up the gravel path and parked directly in front of my cabin. A tall, impeccably groomed man stepped out of the vehicle. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, an expensive silk tie, and a pair of polished leather shoes that had absolutely no business being out in the country dirt. He carried a thick leather briefcase and walked with an exaggerated sense of self-importance. I opened the door before he could even knock, leaning heavily against the wooden frame. The man flashed a bright, perfectly white smile that completely failed to reach his cold, calculating eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Preston Reed. He spoke in a slow, patronizing tone, loudly explaining that my son Derek had personally hired him to conduct a routine senior wellness check. He claimed that the family was simply concerned about my physical health and cognitive well-being, given my advanced age and recent tragic loss. I stared at him blankly, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. I nodded slowly, stepping aside to let the wolf into my home. Dr. Reed walked into my modest cabin and immediately looked around with an expression of thinly veiled disgust. He sat down at my small wooden table, opened his expensive briefcase, and pulled a stack of clinical evaluation forms. He gestured for me to sit across from him. I shuffled over slowly, dragging my boots against the floorboards, and collapsed heavily into the wooden chair. I let my hands rest on the table deliberately, making my fingers tremble. The psychological interrogation began immediately. Dr. Reed did not ask standard medical questions. He asked highly manipulative leading questions designed specifically to confuse me. He asked me to recount the exact details of my corporate trust structure, rapidly firing off complex financial terms to overwhelm my senses. He casually asked me what year my wife had passed away, purposely suggesting an incorrect date to see if I would blindly agree with him. He held up a simple ink pen and aggressively demanded that I tell him the exact manufacturing brand printed on the side, moving the object too quickly for any normal person to focus on. I played his wicked game to absolute perfection. I gave him exactly what he came to collect. I stared blankly at the pen and mumbled that my vision was getting very blurry. When he asked about the trust documents, I rubbed my forehead and weakly complained that all the banking paperwork gave me terrible headaches and that Derek handled all the big numbers for me. When he intentionally mixed up the date of Martha's death, I simply nodded, wiping a fake tear from my eye and whispering that I missed her so much that the years just faded together. I watched his arrogant face light up with a sinister, triumphant satisfaction. He aggressively scribbled detailed notes onto his clinical forms, legally documenting my manufactured confusion and fabricated mental decline. He was building the exact medical prison Victoria had requested. After 30 agonizing minutes, Dr. Reed snapped his leather briefcase shut. He stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and offered me another hollow, predatory smile. He told me that I had done a wonderful job, and that he would speak with my loving family about getting me the proper residential care I so desperately needed. I remained seated at the table, offering him a weak, trembling wave goodbye. I waited until I heard the heavy wooden door click shut behind him. The moment he was outside, I instantly dropped the fragile, confused act. I stood up with perfect posture, my mind razor-sharp and burning with a lethal focus. I walked quietly to the front window and peered through the dusty glass panes to watch him leave. Dr. Reed did not walk straight to his luxury sedan. He walked toward the main estate driveway where Victoria was already waiting for him. She was wearing a winter coat, looking nervously over her shoulder toward the massive mansion to ensure Derek was nowhere in sight. I assumed she was going to hand the corrupt doctor an envelope of cash for his fraudulent medical services, but she did not hand him a check. She did not shake his hand. Instead, Victoria reached out, grabbed the lapels of his charcoal suit, and forcefully pulled him behind the massive trunk of an ancient oak tree, shielding them from the view of the main house. Through a small gap in the winter branches, I watched with absolute horrifying clarity as my daughter-in-law threw her arms around the doctor's neck and kissed him passionately. The man who had just clinically assessed my sanity was not just a hired mercenary. He was her secret lover. The magnitude of her ultimate betrayal was finally revealed. I did not waste another precious second staring blankly through the frosted glass of my cabin window. The nauseating image of Victoria kissing the very man hired to destroy my legal autonomy burned itself into my mind, completely erasing any lingering trace of paternal hesitation. I immediately grabbed my worn leather wallet and my heavy rusted car keys from the small wooden kitchen counter. I walked out the back door, climbed into the freezing cab of my rusted 20-year-old Chevy truck, and jammed the key into the ignition. The old engine loudly sputtered and roared to life, a harsh mechanical sound that perfectly matched the furious pounding of my racing heart. I threw the truck into gear and sped down the back access road of the estate, purposely avoiding the main gates so Derek and Victoria would not see me leave. The drive to downtown Hartford took 45 agonizing minutes. The freezing rain had finally stopped, entirely leaving the gray city streets slick and highly reflective under the pale afternoon sun. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with a cold, singular focus. I aggressively pulled my battered truck into the massive underground parking garage of a towering, ultra-modern glass skyscraper. It was the headquarters of one of the most powerful and feared corporate law firms on the Eastern Coast. I bypassed the sleek marbled guest reception area and took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. I did not need an appointment. The man I was coming to see owed his entire lucrative career to the massive logistics contracts I had fed him over the past 3 decades. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the corner suite and strode inside. Sitting behind a massive custom-built obsidian desk was Mitchell Crawford. Mitchell was a ruthless 70-something corporate attorney with a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass that firmly pointed toward whatever benefited his highest-paying clients. We had fought countless brutal corporate wars together. He looked up from his legal documents, his sharp gray eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. I was still wearing my faded flannel shirt, muddy work boots, and a damp winter jacket. Mitchell leaned back in his expensive ergonomic chair, letting out a dry, condescending scoff that echoed in the quiet, sterile office. He bluntly told me that I looked like a homeless vagrant who had just wandered in from a local soup kitchen. He casually reminded me, tapping his expensive gold fountain pen against his desk, that I still had over $40 million quietly sitting in offshore logistics investments and high-yield corporate bonds that my family knew absolutely nothing about. He asked me why I continued to dress like a penniless lumberjack when I could easily buy the entire skyscraper we were currently sitting in. I walked across the plush carpet, pulled out a thick leather chair, and sat down directly across from him. I ignored his sarcastic commentary entirely. I reached deep into the breast pocket of my damp flannel shirt and pulled out the crumpled, half-burnt piece of paper my grandson Leo had rescued from the fireplace. I tossed the damaged document onto the polished surface of his obsidian desk. I told him to look at the paper and then tell me if my choice of clothing was the most pressing issue we had to deal with today. Mitchell sighed, picking up the scorched document. As his sharp eyes scanned the official federal seal and the bold, unforgiving text of the Internal Revenue Service, notice the smug, arrogant amusement completely vanished from his wrinkled face. His posture instantly stiffened. He carefully read the final balance owed, quietly muttering the staggering $8 million figure under his breath. He looked up at me, his expression shifting from corporate boredom to absolute, razor-sharp professional alertness. He, completely stunned, asked me how in the world Derek had managed to bankrupt a highly profitable freight company and trigger a massive federal tax lien in just 3 short years. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on his desk. I told him that the tax debt was only the surface of the betrayal. I systematically laid out every single horrifying detail I had uncovered over the past 3 days. I told him about the violent slap at the Thanksgiving dinner table and my cowardly son refusing to defend me. I explained the sudden permanent arrival of Patricia and her wearing my late wife vintage pearls to intentionally provoke a public, highly documented reaction from me. I told him about the property appraisers secretly measuring the main estate for a forced liquidation sale. Finally, I thoroughly told him about the slick, arrogant doctor who had just visited my cabin an hour ago. I described the highly manipulative, deeply confusing psychological test Preston Reed had administered under the false guise of a senior wellness check. I finished the grim narrative by describing the passionate kiss I had witnessed behind the oak tree between Victoria and the corrupt medical professional. Mitchell did not say a single word for a long, heavy moment. He simply stared at me, processing sheer sociopathic magnitude of the conspiracy my own family had constructed against me. Then he abruptly spun his chair around to face his massive multi-monitor computer setup. His fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard with a sudden, frantic urgency. He opened a secure, encrypted database bypassing standard firewalls to access restricted state and federal medical registries. I sat in the quiet office listening to the rapid clicking of his keyboard, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the impending legal battle settling firmly onto my shoulders. Mitchell pulled up several complex legal records, his eyes darting quickly back and forth across the glowing digital screens. The silence in the room grew increasingly tight, almost unbearable, as he dug deeper into the hidden professional history of the man who had just evaluated my sanity. Suddenly, Mitchell abruptly stopped typing. He let out a low, deeply troubled breath, heavily leaning his elbows on his desk. He turned his chair back around to face me, his gray eyes shadowed with a profound, highly disturbing realization. The usual arrogant swagger of the ruthless corporate lawyer was completely gone. He reached across the desk, tapping a manicured finger directly onto the burned Internal Revenue Service document. Mitchell looked at me grimly, his voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper that sent a violent physical chill directly down my spine. He told me that he had just pulled the complete professional record of Preston Reed. The terrible man was a disgraced psychiatrist who had his medical license officially suspended in another state 2 years ago for actively participating in a massive coordinated medical fraud ring. Mitchell leaned closer, his expression dead serious, and delivered a chilling warning that completely changed the entire trajectory of my immediate survival plan and altered everything I thought I knew. He stated, "Harrison, they are not just trying to take the house. A dementia diagnosis from this guy gives Victoria medical power of attorney. She can put you in a state-run lockdown facility by Friday." The trap was perfectly set. Now I needed concrete proof to spring it closed. The audio of Victoria setting up the fraudulent evaluation was damning, but not enough to legally dismantle their operation and shield myself from the tax liability. I needed a comprehensive record of their embezzlement and irrefutable evidence of her affair with the corrupt doctor. Mitchell provided exactly what I needed during my visit. Tucked safely inside my winter coat was a sophisticated, military-grade global positioning system tracker equipped with an audio bug. It was about the size of a matchbox. I sat by the window the following morning, drinking black coffee and watching the driveway. At around 10 o'clock, the heavy doors of the mansion swung open. Victoria and Patricia walked out dressed in bright white tennis skirts and wearing oversized designer sunglasses. They climbed into Victoria's gleaming white luxury sport utility vehicle and sped down the gravel driveway toward their private country club. They were completely oblivious to the catastrophic federal debt hanging over their heads, consumed by their desperate need to maintain their aristocratic social facade. I waited until the iron gates at the end of the property closed securely behind them before making my move. I walked across the manicured lawn and slipped through the side entrance of the massive four-car garage. The space was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of expensive motor oil and polished leather. Derek had taken his imported sports car to the corporate office, but Victoria had left her secondary daily driving vehicle, a massive black luxury sport utility vehicle, parked in the center bay. It was the vehicle she exclusively used for her private evening errands in the city. I approached the heavy vehicle, grateful that her careless arrogance meant she rarely bothered to lock the doors when parked inside the secure estate. I opened the driver's side door and immediately slid onto the cold concrete floor, contorting my aging body to slide underneath the steering column. The space was incredibly cramped and smelled sharply of the overpowering vanilla air freshener she constantly used. I clicked on a small pen light, holding it between my teeth as my hands navigated the complex wiring harness hidden deep beneath the dashboard panels. My muscles ached in fierce protest, a sharp reminder of my 78 years, but I pushed through the physical pain with absolute, cold determination. I located the primary power line connecting the vehicle battery to the central console. Using a small pair of wire strippers, I carefully spliced the sophisticated tracking device directly into the constant power supply. This ensured the transmitter would never run out of battery and would continuously broadcast crisp audio whenever the vehicle was running. Just as I was tightly wrapping black electrical tape around the exposed wires to secure the hidden device, a sudden soft shuffling sound echoed from the garage entrance. My heart slammed violently against my ribcage. I froze completely, the cold concrete pressing against my spine. I slowly turned my head, preparing to fabricate a believable excuse for why I was dismantling the underside of my daughter-in-law's luxury vehicle. Standing just a few feet away, clutching a worn baseball cap in his small hands, was my grandson Leo. He had been quietly observing me from the shadows. For a long, terrifying moment, neither of us said a single word. I mentally prepared for him to run back into the mansion and alert the household staff. Instead, Leo took a few cautious steps forward. He looked down at the array of metal tools I had scattered across the garage floor. Without a shred of hesitation, he reached down, picked up my small steel wrench, and silently handed it to me under the open door. I took the tool, looking up into his innocent, deeply observant eyes. He did not ask what I was doing. He crouched down beside me, wrapping his arms around his knees. He looked over his shoulder toward the door leading into the main house, his voice dropping to a heartbreaking, fragile whisper. He told me that his mother yelled at his father every single night when they thought he was sleeping. He whispered that she constantly said she hated living here and that she was planning to take him far away very soon. The sheer sadness radiating from his small voice fractured the hardened shell surrounding my heart. I slid out from under the dashboard and sat up, pulling the boy into a tight, reassuring embrace. I promised him that nobody was going to take him away and that I was doing everything in my power to protect him. I reached into my deep coat pocket and pulled out a brand new soft brown teddy bear. It looked entirely ordinary, the kind of plush toy you would buy at any local gift shop. But hidden expertly within the dark, glassy eye of the bear was a motion-activated high-definition nanny camera provided by Mitchell's private security team. I handed the soft toy to Leo, looking him directly in the eyes. I told him that this bear was a very special guard. I asked him to be my brave partner and to take the bear upstairs. I instructed him to place it securely on the very top shelf of the formal living room, directly overlooking his father's desk in the adjacent open study. Leo took the bear, hugging it tightly against his chest. He gave me a firm, resolute nod, a silent pact forged between a grandfather and a grandson trapped in a house of toxic lies. That evening, a heavy winter frost settled over the quiet property. I sat alone at my small kitchen table inside the dark cabin, staring intensely at the glowing screen of my laptop. A digital map of the city was displayed, a small red dot blinking rhythmically to indicate the exact location of Victoria's black luxury vehicle. She had proudly announced at the dinner table earlier that she was attending a late-night literature discussion with her prestigious book club in the affluent suburbs. But the red dot on my screen told a vastly different story. The vehicle had not traveled toward the quiet residential suburbs. It had driven directly into the bustling heart of downtown Hartford. I watched the digital marker pull into a parking structure and come to a complete stop. I cross-referenced the precise geographical coordinates provided by the tracker with the detailed residential property records Mitchell had sent me. The address was a towering, highly exclusive high-rise condominium complex overlooking the city river. It was the exact luxury building registered as the primary private residence of Dr. Preston Reed. The arrogant, corrupt psychiatrist who had been hired to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me away in a state facility was currently entertaining my deceitful daughter-in-law in his private penthouse. The trap was closing rapidly, and the sheer magnitude of their absolute betrayal was finally stepping completely out of the shadows. I leaned back in my chair, pressing the record button on the audio interface, ready to capture every single wicked word they spoke into the quiet night. The digital clock on my rustic kitchen wall blinked exactly 3 a.m. when the heavy tires of a sleek luxury sedan rolled quietly up my long, winding gravel driveway, cutting through the dense, freezing air. The freezing November rain had finally stopped, leaving a thick layer of fog clinging to the bare oak trees surrounding my property. Mitchell stepped out into the bitter cold air carrying a thick leather briefcase and a heavily encrypted laptop under his dark wool coat. He did not bother knocking, simply pushing the heavy wooden door open and stepping inside with a grim, stony expression that perfectly mirrored the heavy dread sitting in my own chest. I had successfully retrieved the tiny audio receiver from the dark shadows beneath the velvet sofa in the main house, and the remote software connected to the motion-activated camera inside Leo's plush teddy bear had already synced its video files to a secure cloud server. Mitchell placed his laptop on my small dining table, silently plugging in the external drives. We did not exchange any polite pleasantries. We quietly poured 2 steaming mugs of bitter black coffee and sat down together at the table in the absolute crushing silence of the cabin. Mitchell slowly pressed a key, and the crisp, high-definition audio from the sophisticated tracking device hidden deep inside Victoria's vehicle began to play clearly through the portable speakers. The initial recording captured the distinct muffled sounds of heavy city traffic and the rhythmic, steady beating of the windshield wipers against the pouring rain. Then the sharp, arrogant voices of Victoria and Patricia sliced through the digital static. They were driving back from the luxury downtown condominium, and their casual conversation immediately plunged into a terrifying depth of financial depravity. For months, Derek had desperately tried to convince me that the freight company was simply suffering from a severe nationwide economic downturn. He claimed that rising fuel costs and lost shipping contracts had slowly bled our corporate accounts dry. But as I listened to the 2 women casually talking in the heated comfort of the luxury vehicle, the sickening truth finally emerged. The company had never failed due to the market economy. It was systematically and ruthlessly bled dry from the inside. Victoria laughed a harsh, grating sound, complaining about how difficult it had been to funnel the commercial profits away from the primary corporate ledger without triggering internal audits or alerting the chief financial officer. Patricia quickly chimed in coldly, calculating the exact financial figures with an astonishing lack of remorse. Over the course of 3 years, they had actively manipulated the vendor invoices and brazenly embezzled a staggering $8 million directly from the company payroll and operational reserves. My hands tightened around my ceramic coffee mug, the hot liquid burning my skin as the magnitude of their sheer stupidity was laid bare. They had not stolen my life's work to secure their future or invest in stable long-term assets. Victoria arrogantly recounted how she had wired every single stolen dollar into a massive, highly volatile offshore cryptocurrency scheme, promoted by one of her wealthy, gullible country club acquaintances. It was a blatant, transparent financial scam, a digital house of cards that had completely collapsed just 6 months ago, reducing $8 million of my hard-earned legacy into absolutely nothing overnight. They had destroyed 40 years of sweat sacrifice and grueling labor just to chase a greedy, delusional fantasy of limitless, unearned wealth. And now that the federal government was kicking down the doors to collect the massive corporate tax deficit they had created, they were desperately looking for a convenient, disposable victim to absorb the fatal blow. Mitchell sat in silence for a moment, his jaw tightly clenched. He then typed a quick command on his keyboard, skipping to the very final audio segment recorded from Victoria's car later that same evening. She had placed a phone call on speakerphone while navigating the dark, winding roads back to the massive estate. The smooth, arrogant voice of the corrupt psychiatrist filled my quiet cabin. Preston Reed was not just offering unethical medical advice. He was intentionally directing a highly coordinated, incredibly vicious criminal conspiracy against me. His calm words slithered through the small digital speakers with a terrifying, calculated, and clinical precision. He calmly outlined the final phase of their devastating plot, detailing the heavy chemical sedatives he planned to legally prescribe to ensure I would be permanently stripped of my basic cognitive functions before any independent judge could intervene. He instructed Victoria to pack her most expensive bags and quietly prepare the international travel documents for herself and my young grandson, confirming their one-way tickets to a secure location in Switzerland. He slowly explained the precise timeline they needed to strictly follow to completely dismantle my entire life without raising any immediate legal suspicions from the state. The sheer, calculated cruelty of his chilling words echoed very loudly in the small, dimly lit room, instantly freezing the warm blood running in my aging veins. Once the frail old man is secured inside the heavily guarded state dementia ward, we forced Derek to quickly sign the $5 million personal liability waiver. Then we confidently take the massive pile of cash from the rapid estate sale, and we completely leave Derek holding the bag for the federal corporate tax investigators. The digital silence that followed that audio clip was heavier than any physical weight I had ever carried. Mitchell did not say a single word. He simply reached over to his laptop keyboard, his face an unreadable mask of pure professional focus, and clicked the next sequential file. This time it was not just a voice recording from the hidden device in the luxury vehicle. It was the high-definition video feed transmitted directly from the motion-activated camera hidden deep inside the glass eye of the plush teddy bear my brave grandson Leo had placed on the top shelf of the formal living room. The video buffered for a brief fraction of a second before the sprawling, immaculate room flickered onto the bright screen. The timestamp displayed in the bottom corner indicated that this footage had been captured just 3 hours ago, right around midnight. The opulent living room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the flickering amber glow of the massive stone fireplace. Derek was pacing aggressively across the expensive Persian rug. His tie was completely undone, hanging loosely around his neck, and his tailored dress shirt was violently wrinkled. He was clutching a thick stack of printed banking statements in his shaking right hand. His face was pale, glistening with a cold, desperate sweat. He kept running his left hand through his hair, muttering frantically to himself as he reviewed the financial documents. A moment later, the heavy wooden doors of the study swung wide open, and Victoria marched into the room. She was still wearing the elegant evening dress she had worn to her supposed book club meeting. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the papers in his hand. Derek did not wait for her to invent another elaborate lie. He aggressively threw the crumpled bank statements directly onto the glass coffee table. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently against the high-vaulted ceilings. He demanded to know why there was a fresh, untraceable wire transfer of $250,000 sent directly to a private offshore account registered to Preston Reed. He furiously yelled that he had spent the entire evening digging through the hidden digital ledgers she thought she had deleted from the corporate servers. He screamed that he knew absolutely everything. He knew the money from the freight company had not simply vanished in a poor economic downturn. He knew she had actively funneled $8 million into a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. Most devastatingly, he screamed that he knew she was currently sleeping with the very same corrupt psychiatrist she had hired to evaluate his father. Victoria did not flinch. She did not fall to her knees and beg for his forgiveness. She did not shed a single tear of remorse for destroying his life, his family, and his corporate legacy. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her posture radiating an absolute chilling arrogance. She looked at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She coldly told him that he was nothing but a weak, pathetic shadow of a man who could not even successfully manage the massive logistics empire his father had freely handed to him. She ruthlessly stated that she deserved a life of limitless luxury, and that she was taking the remaining liquid assets and leaving him to deal with the catastrophic federal tax consequences on his own. I sat in the dark cabin watching the glowing screen with bated breath. This was the absolute, undeniably crucial moment of truth. This was the exact second my son could have chosen to finally be a man, to demand accountability, and to fiercely protect the father who had spent 40 years building the very roof over his head. I desperately wanted him to threaten her with federal prison. I wanted him to pick up the telephone and call the police. I wanted him to show just one single ounce of the moral fortitude his mother and I had worked so incredibly hard to instill in him. But the hidden camera captured a display of cowardice so profound, so deeply sickening, that it physically nauseated me to my very core. Derek did not raise his voice again. The righteous anger instantly evaporated from his pale face, completely replaced by a pathetic, suffocating terror. He let out a loud, broken sob and dropped heavily onto his knees right in the middle of the living room floor. He reached out with shaking hands, desperately clutching the expensive fabric of Victoria's evening dress. He wept uncontrollably, a grown man groveling at the feet of a woman who was actively plotting to destroy him. He looked up at her, tears streaming rapidly down his flushed face, and he said the exact words that forever severed the profound biological bond between us. He cried out, "I do not care about the money. I do not care about the old man. I will sign the committal papers tomorrow. Just please do not take Leo and leave me." The words echoed through the small speakers of Mitchell's laptop, hanging toxically in the quiet, damp air of my rustic cabin. I did not gasp. I did not shed a single tear. I felt a profound physiological shift occur deep within the very center of my chest. The warm, forgiving, and endlessly patient heart of a loving father instantly died. It was rapidly replaced by a cold, desolate wasteland of pure, unadulterated stone. The man weeping pathetically on that glowing digital screen was no longer my son. He was a complete stranger. I was a spineless, compromised accomplice who was fully willing to sell my fundamental human freedom to a psychiatric prison just to keep a vicious, manipulating woman who despised him. Victoria looked down at her groveling husband with a chilling, triumphant smirk. She reached out and gently patted his cheek, treating him exactly like a well-trained, obedient dog. She softly told him to wipe his face and prepare the necessary medical authorization documents for the following afternoon. She promised him that everything was going to be perfectly fine as long as he followed her precise instructions and eliminated my legal authority. The video feed abruptly cut to black as the motion sensor deactivated, leaving Mitchell and me sitting in the suffocating darkness. The cold digital silence that filled my cabin after that final recording stopped playing was absolute. The sheer calculated malice of their conversation echoed in my ears, completely extinguishing the very last flicker of fatherly compassion I held in my heart. They had absolutely no idea that they had just awakened a ruthless, calculating titan of industry who possessed the exact financial resources and legal weaponry required to obliterate their entire existence. The time for observation and evidence gathering was officially over. I slowly turned my head to look at Mitchell. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the wooden table, and gave him the only order that mattered. I told him to burn it all down to the ground tonight. Mitchell did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately reached into his dark wool coat, pulled out his secure satellite phone, and began making the calls that would completely obliterate their entire existence. His first call was directly to a senior contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Unit. He formally reported the $8 million embezzlement scheme, providing the exact offshore routing numbers Victoria had carelessly discussed on the audio recordings. His second call was to the lead investigators at the Internal Revenue Service, explicitly linking the stolen corporate funds to the massive tax deficit and offering full unhindered cooperation from the primary trust holder. His final call was to the State Medical Board and the Regional Criminal Prosecutor. He laid out the undeniable recorded proof of a coordinated medical fraud conspiracy actively led by a disgraced psychiatrist named Preston Reed. The federal warrants were being expedited. The trap was set, and the authorities were already quietly moving into position around the perimeter of my sprawling estate. We just needed to lure all the rats into the exact same room. The next 24 hours passed with an agonizing, meticulous slowness. I did not leave the isolated safety of my log cabin. I spent the time carefully staging the interior of my small home for the final devastating confrontation. I wanted their arrogant confidence to reach its absolute peak before I completely destroyed it. I went to my small wooden wardrobe and pulled out the oldest, rattiest clothes I owned. I put on a pair of deeply stained, fraying denim jeans and a moth-eaten wool sweater that hung loosely over my aging frame. I purposely neglected to shave, letting a rough white stubble cover my jawline. I wanted to look exactly like the fragile, broken, and deeply confused old man they desperately needed me to be. I carefully connected my mobile phone to the powerful high-fidelity Bluetooth speaker system I had discreetly hidden on the top shelf of my kitchen cabinetry. I set the volume to its absolute maximum capacity. I opened the audio application, navigated to the specific, undeniable recording of Victoria and Dr. Reed planning their malicious getaway, and paused the track at the exact moment their sinister voices began to speak. I poured myself a steaming mug of bitter black coffee, walked over to my heavy leather armchair facing the front entrance, and sat down to wait for my executioners to arrive. The afternoon sun began to dip low behind the towering oak trees, casting long, dark, and freezing shadows across the damp gravel driveway. The estate was eerily quiet, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that always precedes a violent storm. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the hot liquid burning my throat, keeping my mind incredibly sharp and focused. Just as the grandfather clock on my wall chimed 4 times, the harsh, heavy crunch of thick tires rolling over the wet gravel shattered the evening quiet. I did not move from my chair. I simply turned my head slightly, peering through the frost-covered glass of my front window. A massive, windowless black transport van was slowly pulling up the long driveway. It did not have any official medical markings or hospital logos. It was a private, highly discreet extraction vehicle, hired specifically to remove a wealthy family problem, without ever drawing any unwanted neighborhood attention. The heavy van came to a sudden, aggressive halt directly in front of my small wooden porch. The driver's side door swung open, and Dr. Preston Reed stepped out into the freezing November air. I was wearing an immaculate tailored navy suit, looking incredibly smug and self-assured. He held a thick, official-looking medical folder tucked securely under his right arm. It contained the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation that would legally strip away my entire life. A moment later, the passenger doors slid open, and the rest of the conspirators emerged. Victoria stepped out first, wearing a dark, elegant designer trench coat. Her face was a mask of cold, predatory determination. Patricia followed closely behind her daughter, clutching her expensive leather handbag, looking incredibly impatient to get this unpleasant chore over with. And then Derek slowly stepped out of the vehicle. My 45-year-old son looked physically ill. His face was chalk white, and he kept his eyes glued firmly to the wet gravel beneath his expensive Italian shoes. He was completely terrified, consumed by his own pathetic cowardice. He was actively marching his own father to a medical prison, choosing to blindly follow a wife who was secretly preparing to leave him, to face the wrath of the federal government alone. But it was the final two figures stepping out of the back of the black van that made my grip tighten fiercely around my ceramic coffee mug. Two massive burly men, wearing dark blue medical scrubs, climbed out of the transport vehicle. They were heavy muscle hired specifically to physically subdue uncooperative patients. One of the men reached into the back seat and casually pulled out a thick, heavy canvas straitjacket. They were fully prepared to drag me out of my own home by absolute brute force if I refused to sign their fraudulent medical surrender forms. I watched through the glass as Dr. Reed confidently gestured toward my front door. The entire group began to march in unison across the damp lawn, their heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the wooden planks of my small front porch. They were coming to take me away. They were coming to erase my legacy, steal my fortune, and lock me in a sterile white room for the rest of my natural life. I lowered my coffee mug onto the small side table. I picked up my mobile phone, placing my right thumb directly over the illuminated play button on the bright digital screen. I leaned back into the deep leather of my armchair, my eyes locked on the brass doorknob, and patiently waited for them to kick open my door. The heavy wooden door did not just open. It shuddered violently on its iron hinges before bursting completely inward, slamming incredibly hard against the interior wall with a deafening crash that echoed loudly through the quiet, isolated cabin. The freezing winter wind immediately swept into the small room, bringing with it the sharp metallic scent of the impending storm and blowing dead leaves across the floor. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle in my worn leather armchair. I kept my hands resting calmly on my lap, deliberately portraying the exact image of a frail, terrified old man who had finally been backed into an inescapable, tragic corner. Victoria was the very first person to boldly step across the threshold. She marched into my modest home with the absolute unyielding confidence of a conquering general, proudly claiming a surrendered territory after a long war. She was wearing a sleek, tailored black trench coat, her dark hair pulled back tightly into a severe, flawless knot that highlighted her sharp features. But it was her face that truly turned my stomach into tight knots. She was wearing a sickeningly sweet, deeply patronizing smile. The exact kind of manufactured expression one might use to falsely soothe a frightened, unruly toddler in a public place. She walked directly toward the center of the room, her heavy designer boots clicking sharply against the wooden floorboards. She looked down at me, her dark eyes gleaming with a predatory, triumphant joy that she could no longer bother to conceal. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, tilting her head slightly to the side, in a grotesque display of fake sympathy and manufactured concern. She spoke in a loud, incredibly slow voice, explicitly enunciating every single syllable as if I were completely deaf and entirely devoid of basic cognitive comprehension. She cheerfully announced that it was finally time to go. She softly stated that Dr. Reed had conclusively determined I desperately needed 24-hour psychiatric care in a secure, professional medical facility where I could no longer be a physical danger to myself or my loving family. Right behind her, Patricia sauntered slowly into the cabin. The older woman immediately brought a manicured hand up to her face, pinching her nose in a highly exaggerated gesture of profound disgust. She audibly scoffed, mutteringly, about the damp, pathetic smell of the rustic cabin, complaining that the wood reeked intensely of decay and miserable poverty. She absolutely refused to step any further into the room, lingering near the open doorway, as if the air inside my home might somehow infect her with a terrible disease. And then finally, my son stepped inside the room. Derek moved with the slow, hesitant reluctance of a man walking directly toward a public execution. He kept his head bowed deeply, his shoulders hunched forward in a pathetic display of absolute paralyzing cowardice. He hid behind the massive physical presence of the two hired medical orderlies, desperately using their broad shoulders as a human shield, so he would not have to look his own father in the eyes. He stared intensely at the scuffed toes of his expensive leather shoes, completely unwilling to witness the devastating destruction he had officially authorized. Dr. Preston Reed strode confidently into the room, completely ignoring the heavy tension radiating between my fractured family members. He moved with the clinical arrogance of a corrupt man who firmly believed he held absolute power over human life and legal autonomy. He walked straight past Victoria, stepping right up to the small wooden table situated next to my armchair. He raised his right hand and violently slapped a thick, heavy plastic clipboard down onto the wooden surface. The sharp, aggressive smack of the plastic hitting the table was explicitly intended to startle me, to establish his absolute physical and psychological dominance in the confined space. Attached securely to the clipboard was a dense stack of official medical documents, prominently featuring a voluntary psychiatric admission form. A silver pen was clipped to the side, waiting for the ink that would sign away my entire existence. Dr. Reed did not bother with the sickeningly sweet tone Victoria had just used. He leaned heavily over to the table, placing his manicured hands flat against the wood, and aggressively invaded my personal space. He looked down his nose at me, his face hardened into a strict mask of cold professional authority. He bluntly ordered me to pick up the pen and sign the voluntary admission form immediately. He did not politely ask for my consent. He did not offer any valid medical explanation for his sudden arrival. He simply delivered harsh, calculated, and deeply uncompromising ultimatum. He stated in a flat voice that if I refused to cooperate and sign the legal paperwork, the two orderlies waiting by the door would physically restrain me. He casually threatened that they would have to administer a heavy chemical sedative to transport me safely. He offered a cruel, empty smile, whispering that making this difficult transition peacefully was entirely for my own good. I slowly shifted my gaze past the corrupt doctor, looking closely at the two massive men standing like stone statues near the entryway. They were imposing, dangerous figures, their incredibly thick arms stretching the fabric of their dark blue medical scrubs to the absolute breaking point. One of them casually adjusted his firm grip on the heavy canvas straitjacket draped over his forearm, silently reinforcing the terrifying threat of physical violence. They were fully prepared to drag me out of my own home, to strap me into a medical transport van, and to lock me behind the reinforced steel doors of a state-run mental asylum. They were patiently waiting for a single silent nod from the man who was secretly sleeping with my daughter-in-law. The air inside the small cabin grew thick, heavy with the metallic tang of the incoming winter storm and the suffocating arrogance of the intruders. Dr. Reed loomed over the wooden table, his immaculate navy suit, a sharp, jarring contrast to the rustic, weathered timber of my home. He reeked of expensive cologne and clinical detachment, completely convinced of his own untouchable superiority. Behind him, Victoria practically vibrated with a dark, predatory adrenaline. She adjusted the belt of her designer trench coat, her eyes darting eagerly toward the heavy canvas straitjacket draped over the orderly's thick arm. She wasn't just observing. She was ravenous, starving for the exact moment my autonomy would be officially erased. I let the agonizing silence stretch out meticulously, absorbing every single detail of the room. I watched Patricia hovering near the doorway, her manicured hand still pinching her nose, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on the precipice of a federal prison sentence. I watched the two hulking medical orderlies shift their weight nervously, instinctively, sensing the unnatural, absolute stillness radiating from my armchair. Most of all, I watched Derek. The sweat beaded on his pale forehead, catching the dim glow of the desk lamp. He looked like a man drowning in a shallow pool, entirely capable of standing up, but too paralyzed by fear to even try. They had walked into my sanctuary, believing they were the apex predators surrounding a wounded, helpless animal. They had no idea they had just locked themselves inside a steel cage with a monster they created. I did not reach for the silver pen resting on the table. I did not cower away from the doctor's highly aggressive posture. I slowly lifted my head, completely ignoring Victoria's victorious smirk, Patricia's disgusted sneer, and the looming physical threat of the hired muscle. I looked directly across the room, fixing my steady, unblinking gaze firmly on the trembling, pathetic figure of my 45-year-old son. The silence in the cabin grew incredibly heavy, thick with the suffocating weight of 40 years of fatherhood, culminating in this absolute ultimate betrayal. Derek tried to turn his head away, but the commanding weight of my silent stare pinned him exactly where he stood. I let out a slow, deep breath, letting the fragile, confused facade I had carefully maintained for the past 3 days slip away entirely. My voice did not shake. It was not weak, and it was not confused. It rang out through the cold cabin with the deep authority of a man who had commanded thousands of employees and crushed countless corporate rivals. I look at Derek. Son, are you really going to let them do this to me? Derek stares at his shoes and whispers, I'm sorry, Dad. You're sick. I nod slowly. No, Derek. You're the one who is sick, but I have the cure. I did not break eye contact with my son, as my right thumb pressed down firmly on the illuminated play button of my mobile phone. For a fraction of a second, the cabin was completely silent, save for howling wind outside. Then the high-fidelity Bluetooth speakers I had strategically hidden above the kitchen cabinetry roared to life. The audio did not begin with static or muffled noise. It began with the crystal-clear, undeniably sharp voice of Victoria Cole, echoing through the small rustic room at absolute maximum volume. She was speaking with a cold, calculating arrogance that stripped away any possible defense she might have tried to invent. Her recorded voice filled the space casually discussing the catastrophic $8 million corporate tax deficit, as if it were nothing more than a minor accounting error. Then the smooth, arrogant voice of Dr. Preston Reed slithered through the speakers, responding to her with sickening intimacy. The man standing right in front of me holding my fraudulent psychiatric admission papers was suddenly broadcasting his own criminal confession to the entire room. His recorded voice calmly and clinically outlined the final phase of their devastating plot. He explicitly detailed the heavy chemical sedatives he planned to prescribe to ensure I would be permanently stripped of my cognitive functions. The audio continued capturing Victoria agreeing to the sinister timeline, confirming her one-way tickets to Switzerland. And then came the final devastating exchange. Dr. Reed's voice echoed loudly against the wooden walls, stating with terrifying precision, once the old man is securely locked inside the heavily guarded state dementia ward, we forced Derek to quickly sign the $5 million personal liability waiver. Then we confidently take the massive pile of cash from the rapid estate sale, and we completely leave Derek holding the bag for the federal corporate tax investigators. The two massive medical orderlies, who had been looming near the doorway with the canvas straitjacket, instantly froze. They exchanged a rapid, nervous glance and immediately took a heavy step backward, instinctively distancing themselves from the escalating disaster. The blood completely drained from Victoria's sharp face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. She was entirely paralyzed by the sudden, indisputable exposure of her ultimate betrayal. But the most profound, devastating reaction belonged to Derek. The heavy, suffocating weight of the audio recording crashed down upon his shoulders, physically buckling his knees. He gasped loudly, a horrible, ragged sound of pure agony, and stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the wooden frame of the front door. He stared at his wife with wide, bloodshot eyes, his entire universe violently shattering into pieces. The woman he had just been willing to sell his own father to a psychiatric prison for was actively planning to frame him for massive federal tax evasion and run away across the world with her secret lover. He realized in that agonizing moment that he was never her partner. He was nothing but a convenient, disposable pawn in her grand sociopathic scheme to extract my wealth. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger at Victoria, his voice breaking into a pathetic whimper as he desperately tried to process the sheer magnitude of her deception. He shook his head frantically from side to side, silently begging her to tell him that the audio was somehow fabricated, a terrible prank. But Victoria could not even look at him. She stared wildly at the hidden speakers above the kitchen cabinets, her chest heaving as she desperately searched the small room for a way to stop the relentless broadcast of her own damning words. Derek let out another harrowing sob, finally understanding that his blind devotion had ultimately secured his own complete destruction. He had willingly marched his father to the slaughterhouse, only to discover that the butcher's blade was secretly meant for his own neck. Patricia was the first to violently snap out of the collective paralysis. The arrogant, condescending woman who had just complained about the smell of my home suddenly realized that her lavish, stolen lifestyle was rapidly evaporating into thin air. Her face contorted into a mask of frantic, desperate fury. She let out a shrill, piercing scream and lunged aggressively across the room, her manicured hands reaching wildly for the mobile phone resting on my small wooden side table. She was completely determined to smash the device and silence the undeniable proof of their criminal conspiracy. I did not cower. I did not shrink back into my chair like the fragile, broken old man they had assumed me to be. I surged upward, my heavy work boots planting firmly onto the floorboards. I brought my clenched right fist down against the solid oak surface of the table with a deafening, thunderous slam. The impact stopped Patricia dead in her tracks just inches from my face. I stood up to my full height, towering over her, radiating the uncompromising authority of a 78-year-old titan of industry who had just finished playing his final hand. I glared down into her terrified, wide eyes, my voice booming through the cabin with a harsh, lethal warning. I told her that if she dared to touch my property, she would be leaving my estate in an ambulance before she ever saw the inside of a jail cell. She scrambled backward, clutching her expensive leather handbag to her chest, thoroughly terrified of the ruthless, calculating man she had foolishly dismissed as a senile hermit. I stood in the center of the quiet room, looking at the terrified faces of the people who had conspired to steal my life. Victoria was hyperventilating near the wall, while Dr. Reed slowly backed toward the open doorway, desperately clutching his fraudulent medical folder as he silently plotted his escape. But their escape route had already been permanently severed. A sudden blinding flash of brilliant light erupted through the frosted glass of my front windows. The dark, gloomy evening was instantly and violently illuminated by a chaotic, sweeping array of bright, flashing red and blue strobe lights. The harsh, rhythmic glare painted the terrified faces of my daughter-in-law and her corrupt lover in alternating shades of stark crimson and deep azure. I looked past their trembling silhouettes toward the gravel driveway. 5 heavily marked state police cruisers and 2 massive, jet-black federal utility vehicles had aggressively surrounded their private medical transport van, completely blocking any possible exit from the estate. Heavy car doors slammed shut in rapid succession, the sound echoing sharply through the freezing rain. The heavy wooden door of my cabin was pushed open entirely. Mitchell Crawford stepped confidently through the doorway, his dark wool coat sweeping behind him. He was closely flanking 2 stern armed federal agents wearing tactical vests. Mitchell looked directly at the panicked, cowering couple, his gray eyes shining with a cold, triumphant justice. He raised his chin and delivered the final devastating blow with absolute terrifying clarity. Victoria Cole and Preston Reed, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and medical malpractice. The sheer velocity of the chaos that erupted inside my small rustic cabin was a staggering, breathtaking sight to behold. The 2 massive medical orderlies who had been fully prepared to forcefully drag me away in a heavy canvas straitjacket did not wait around to ask any questions or defend their corrupt employer. As soon as the heavily armed federal agents stepped into the room, with their golden badges flashing brightly under the piercing blue and red strobe lights from outside, the hired muscle immediately dropped their medical equipment onto the hardwood floor. They aggressively shoved past Patricia, knocking her expensive leather handbag to the floor, and frantically sprinted out the open door into the freezing rain, desperately fleeing into the dark woods to escape imminent federal prosecution. Dr. Preston Reed did not have the luxury of running away. Before the corrupt psychiatrist could even formulate a single arrogant lie to defend his malicious actions, one of the federal agents aggressively lunged forward. He firmly grabbed Dr. Reed by the collar of his tailored navy suit and violently slammed him face first against the rough wooden wall of the cabin. The heavy thud rattled the framed photographs as cold steel handcuffs were securely snapped shut around his wrists. The man who had confidently planned to lock me in a heavily medicated prison was now effectively silenced, his arrogant face pressed humiliatingly against the rough timber while he was read his rights. Victoria let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that completely shattered the tense, freezing air. A stern female officer firmly grabbed her flailing arms, twisting them behind her back with a practiced, unforgiving physical efficiency. Victoria thrashed wildly against the restraint, her sleek designer trench coat slipping off her shoulders as the heavy handcuffs clicked tightly into place. She desperately turned her terrified, tear-streaked face toward my son, screaming for Derek to do something, pleading with him to use his money and corporate influence to make the federal authorities stop. But Derek did absolutely nothing. He was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the vicious woman who had secretly plotted to frame him for massive federal tax evasion. At that exact moment, another pair of federal investigators stepped deeply into the room and approached Patricia. She tried to maintain her fragile aristocratic dignity, arrogantly demanding that they remove their filthy working-class hands from her expensive designer clothing. The lead investigator simply handed her a printed arrest warrant, coldly stating that she was officially being taken into federal custody for her active, willing participation in an $8 million corporate embezzlement scheme and multiple counts of wire fraud. Her arrogant facade instantly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as she was roughly escorted out the wooden door alongside her frantically screaming daughter. With the treacherous conspirators physically removed from the premises, the modest cabin suddenly felt incredibly large and suffocatingly quiet. Mitchell Crawford stood silently by the open door, watching the flashing police lights and allowing me to handle the final piece of unfinished family business. Derek slowly turned his pale face toward me. The profound, unescapable gravity of his catastrophic personal and professional failures finally crushed whatever remaining strength he possessed in his cowardly body. He let out a loud, pathetic sob and fell heavily onto his knees, crawling pathetically across the damp floorboards until he was directly at my boots. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the fabric of my faded denim jeans. He wept uncontrollably, like a frightened child begging for my paternal forgiveness, desperately crying out that they had manipulated his trusting nature. He swore that he had absolutely no idea how bad the financial situation truly was, pleading with me to use my hidden wealth to save him from absolute federal ruin. I looked down at the pathetic, groveling man weeping on my floor, and I felt absolutely zero emotion. My heart was a fortified stone fortress. I slowly reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the master deed to the irrevocable trust, the very legal document they had violently tried to steal from my lockbox. I casually dropped the heavy folded parchment directly onto his heaving chest. I told him that I had handed him an incredibly prosperous empire, and in return he had actively tried to trade my fundamental human freedom just to keep a vicious, cheating wife. I informed him in a cold, steady voice that the federal tax agents were officially seizing his entire estate by the following morning. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that he was officially homeless. The following months moved with a swift, merciless legal justice. Victoria and Patricia were both convicted of multiple federal felonies, including wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. They are currently serving 10-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of their designer clothes, their stolen jewelry, and their false aristocratic pride. Preston Reed permanently lost his medical license and was sentenced to 8 years behind bars for his coordinated medical malpractice and fraud. As for Derek, the federal government ruthlessly liquidated every single asset he falsely claimed to own to satisfy the corporate penalties. He went entirely bankrupt, unable to secure any corporate employment due to his permanently ruined reputation. Today, my former chief executive officer works the grueling night shift at a cheap, run-down automotive repair shop, living entirely alone in a dingy roadside motel on the dirty outskirts of the city. I did not offer him a single penny of financial assistance. He is finally learning the true, undeniable value of an honest, grueling day of hard labor. Once the toxic parasites were completely excised from my daily life, I officially activated my $40 million offshore reserves. I swiftly paid off the $8 million corporate tax deficit, cleared all lingering company debts, and proudly retook my rightful position as the active chief executive officer of the freight empire. Most importantly, my ruthless legal team easily secured me full uncontested legal custody of my grandson Leo, permanently rescuing him from the devastating wreckage of his parents' profound moral failures. Today we sit at the head of a massive mahogany dining table for an early Thanksgiving dinner. The sprawling estate is bright, warm, and entirely free of fake aristocrats. There are no shallow socialites or manipulative mothers-in-law trying to dictate our worth. Sitting around the table are just me, Leo Mitchell Crawford, and the loyal, hard-working warehouse foreman who tirelessly helped me rebuild the company from the brink of absolute ruin. We share a genuine, hearty meal, filling the room with honest laughter and profound gratitude for the new, untainted life we have built together. Family is supposed to be your ultimate sanctuary, but blood does not guarantee loyalty when you spend your life providing for people who only value you for your wallet. You aren't showing them love, you are funding your own destruction. True respect cannot be bought, and cowardice in the face of greed will inevitably burn an empire to the ground. Never hand over the keys to your life until you are entirely sure the people receiving them have the integrity to protect you when you can no longer protect yourself. Generosity without boundaries is just an invitation for parasites. If this story proved that tough love is sometimes the only way to save yourself, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments below. Stay strong.